Well, new at noon, the state of Oklahoma executed its second death row inmate this year. 35-year-old Gilbert Postelle was declared dead at 10:14 a.m. 2 News Oklahoma's Naomi Kitt is live in McAlester, hearing from the sister of one of the victims. Naomi.
In May 2005, in a quiet mobile home in Oklahoma, laughter was suddenly replaced by gunfire. 4 people fell in a brutal massacre, turning a normal afternoon into a tomb. The perpetrator, Gilbert Postelle, gave no one a chance. Nearly 17 years later, on February 17, 2022, the killer faced justice in the execution chamber. But the story doesn't end there. Behind the horrific crime was a life full of hidden corners, an abandoned child, a teenager sunk in addiction. What turned a hurt boy into a cold-blooded demon? We will look back at his final hours, from his surprisingly simple last meal to his shocking final words of remorse and forgiveness. Is repentance at death's door enough to soothe the pain he caused? Or were they just the final words of a manipulator? The secret of Gilbert Postelle's true motive may have followed him to the grave. Viewer discretion is advised. The content contains details of violence and real crime. On May 30, 2005, Memorial Day, a bloodbath occurred at a home in Oklahoma City. 4 people, Donnie Swindle, James Alderson, Terry Smith, and Amy Wright, were murdered in a brutal blitz attack. The mastermind was none other than Gilbert Ray Postelle, along with his brother David Postelle, their father Brad Postelle, and another man named Randall Wade Bias. Before the attack, Brad Postelle had suffered a serious motorcycle accident, leading to a traumatic brain injury and persistent seizures. The motive for the murders was believed to stem from Postelle's mistaken belief that Swindle was responsible for his father's accident, although there was no evidence to prove it. A notable detail is that before being murdered, the victims were herded into the yard outside the mobile home and forced to their knees. This detail becomes important when considering the brutality and calculation in the perpetrator's actions. This case not only shocked the public with the number of victims and its savage nature, but also because of the complex circumstances surrounding family relationships and the incomprehensible motive. Let us delve deeper into the lives of those who were lost and the life of the one who took their lives. Before the tragedy, Donnie Swindle, James Alderson, Terry Smith, and Amy Wright each had their own stories, their own lives in progress. Donnie Swindle, believed to be the main target of the attack, was an individual connected to Brad Postelle through the motorcycle accident, though this connection was later proven to be baseless. Donnie's mother, Mary Jo Swindle, would later painfully recount that she was not even allowed to see her son's body because it was so riddled with bullets. James Alderson and Amy Wright were 2 of the victims who tried to flee the massacre, but in vain. Their lives were cut short abruptly, leaving behind unquenchable grief for those left behind. Meanwhile, Gilbert Ray Postelle's life was a chain of misfortune and mistakes. Abandoned by his mother as a child, Gilbert began using methamphetamine daily from the age of 12. His living environment was also unhealthy. His father, Earl Bradford, Brad Postelle, had been convicted of drug offenses in 1996 and was suspected of manufacturing methamphetamine behind his house in 1999. Although these charges were later dismissed, it paints a picture of the presence of drugs and crime in the Postelle family. Gilbert had been arrested at least 8 times in Midwest City for drug manufacturing and weapons complaints. The lives of the victims and the life of Gilbert Postelle, though seemingly parallel, collided tragically. On one side were people living their lives, perhaps imperfect, but full of hope. On the other was an individual caught in a vortex of addiction and violence, heavily influenced by his family environment. Their fateful intersection led to an irreversible tragedy. But there was one detail about Amy Wright that even her family did not know she had been shot from behind while trying to flee, showing the perpetrator's ultimate cruelty. Gilbert Ray Postelle's life was a series of problems from a very young age. Abandoned and addicted as a teenager, he quickly spiraled into a life of crime. Arrests related to drugs and weapons painted a clear picture of an individual sliding down a dangerous path. Gilbert's father, Brad Postelle, was not a good role model either. His criminal history related to drugs, along with the traumatic brain injury from the accident before the crime, created significant pressure and influence on Gilbert. According to criminal psychologists, a neglected living environment. The absence of positive parental role models and early exposure to addictive substances can form individuals who are easily agitated and prone to violence. In Gilbert's case, his daily methamphetamine use from the age of 12 indicates a much deeper problem than just a one-time criminal act. It was the result of a long process of physical and mental destruction, causing him to lose control of his behavior and emotions. Looking back at the chain of events, a pattern of escalating violence can be seen. From minor arrests for drugs and weapons to participating in a brutal massacre, Postelle's behavior showed a lack of remorse and an increasing severity of his crimes. There are 5 warning signs that everyone should know: first, drug use from a young age; second, a family environment with a criminal history; third, continuous arrests related to weapons and banned substances; fourth, a tendency to blame others for one's own problems; and finally, impulsivity and an inability to control anger. These signs, when combined, can signal a potential risk of serious violent behavior. The massacre of May 30th, 2005 was a terrifying moment, seen from many different perspectives. Donnie Swindle, James Alderson, Terry Smith, and Amy Wright did not know they were about to face the most brutal death. They were herded into the yard, forced to their knees, an act intended to inflict absolute terror. Amy Wright and James Alderson, in a desperate attempt to escape, ran. But unfortunately, that action only made them clearer targets. The sound of an AK-47 tore through the air, and they fell with bullet wounds from behind, showing the killer's mercilessness and brutality. Each victim faced extreme horror in the final moments of their lives. Gilbert Postelle, under the influence of drugs and a false belief, carried out this act with cold cruelty. He fired more than 30 rounds from an AK-47 rifle, sowing death upon all 4 victims. For Gilbert, this was perhaps not just an act of revenge, but also a release of pent-up frustrations fueled by his father's words and the effects of stimulants. He did not remember much about the crime, according to his later testimony, which could be due to the influence of drugs or a psychological defense mechanism. Although no direct witnesses were mentioned in detail in the case, the appearance of a dark brown van on a security camera suggests that there were indirect eyes that witnessed a part of the crime without understanding its full horror. The presence of accomplices like David Postelle, Brad Postelle, and Randall Wade Bias also paints a collective picture of violence where individuals came together to commit this brutal act. For the victims' families, the pain was boundless. Mary Jo Swindle. Donnie Swindle's mother had to endure the trauma of not being able to see her son intact. The deaths of their loved ones tore their lives apart, leaving scars that would never heal. They longed for justice and truth, wanting the perpetrator to pay for his sins. After the massacre, an urgent investigation was launched. On July 7th, detectives tracked a dark brown van similar to the one seen in surveillance footage, leaving the crime scene to Terre Haute, Indiana, where it was found. Avis Sanders told police that he and Daniel Ashcraft had driven the van to Indiana. Police recovered trace evidence from the van's small but crucial details to connect the suspects to the scene. Modern forensic methods played a crucial role. From fingerprints and fibers to DNA collected from the van and the scene, every piece of the puzzle was meticulously analyzed. Forensic scientists worked tirelessly to reconstruct the chain of events, identify the types of weapons used, and link them to the suspects. The combination of witness testimony indirectly through Avis Sanders and scientific evidence created a solid foundation for the investigation. The key evidence collected from the van proved its direct link to the crime scene, and the fact that Avis Sanders and Daniel Ashcraft drove it provided valuable information about the individuals involved. These clues ultimately led to the arrests. But the investigators did not know that one of the main suspects, Brad Postelle Gilbert's father, would never face justice because the injuries from his motorcycle accident rendered him incompetent to stand trial. The pursuit of the suspects happened quickly after the van was found. After gathering sufficient evidence and identifying them, the police began to hunt down the members of the Postelle family and their associates. On August 16, 2005, David Postelle and Brad Postelle were arrested. Shortly after, on August 17, 2005, Gilbert Postelle was also captured. Additionally, Avis Sanders, Daniel Ashcroft, and Arthur James Wilder were arrested and charged as accessories to murder. Although there was no international manhunt element, as in some other cases, the discovery of the van in Terre Haute, Indiana, showed an attempt by the suspects to flee the state of Oklahoma, hoping to escape the law. The lives of these fugitives must have been filled with fear and anxiety, knowing that the police were right behind them. There were moments when it seemed they might get away with it. The van had traveled a considerable distance before being discovered. But thanks to the close coordination between law enforcement agencies and meticulous evidence tracking, especially the dark brown van, all attempts to escape were futile. This case shows that no matter how hard one tries to hide the smallest pieces of evidence can lead to a criminal's capture. Gilbert Postelle faced a public trial. In 2008, after a tense trial, Postelle was sentenced to 2 death sentences for the deaths of Amy Wright and James Alderson, and life sentences without parole for the deaths of Donnie Swindle and Terry Smith. This was a severe verdict reflecting the brutal nature of the crime he had committed. The legal angle of this case was complex. First was the charge of first-degree murder, with aggravating circumstances of being heinous, atrocious, or cruel, creating a great risk of death to more than one person and a continuing threat to society. The fact that Postelle fired more than 30 shots from an AK-47, chasing down and shooting fleeing victims, clearly showed heinous and intentional acts to take lives. His being sentenced to 2 death sentences for the deaths of Wright and Alderson, who had tried to flee, emphasized the brutal nature of his actions. The prosecution's strategy was to focus on the organized and savage nature of the attack, as well as Gilbert's active role in using the weapon. They used forensic evidence testimony from co-conspirators Randall Wade Bias, took a plea deal to testify against Postelle, and testimony from indirect witnesses to build a solid case. Meanwhile, Postelle's defense tried to mitigate his culpability by highlighting his history of abandonment, early age addiction, and the influence of his brain-damaged father. However, these arguments were not convincing enough for the jury, given the severity of the crime. Gilbert's brother, David Postelle, was also sentenced to life without parole. Their father, Brad Postelle, was declared incompetent to stand trial due to his accident-related injuries and passed away in 2011. After his conviction, Gilbert Postelle went through many stages of appeals and clemency hearings. During his clemency hearing in December 2021, Postelle made confessions and expressed remorse, although their sincerity was disputed. During the hearing, Postelle's lawyer, Robert Nance, argued that he had a learning disability with a low IQ and grew up in an almost entirely negative environment. Nance said, "I think he needs a certain level of forgiveness because he grew up in a context that was almost exclusively negative." Postelle also testified himself, saying he had been using methamphetamine for days before the crime and did not remember much about it. He also claimed he was heavily influenced by his brain-damaged father at the time of the offense. Postelle said, "I do understand that I'm guilty, and I accept that. There's nothing more that I know to say to you all than I am truly sorry for what I've done to all these families. An analysis of the language in Postelle's confession shows an admission of guilt, but also an element of seeking mitigation by blaming his environment and the influence of drugs, as well as his lack of memory of the event. This cast doubt on the authenticity of his remorse. His inability to provide specific details about the crime could be due to the influence of stimulants, but it could also be a way to avoid fully confronting his actions. However, the testimony of Mary Jo Swindle, mother of victim Donnie Swindle, contradicted parts of this confession. She painfully recounted that she was never allowed to see her son's body because it was so riddled with bullets. This highlighted the contrast between Postelle's general apology and the specific indelible pain of the victims' families. The Pardon and Parole Board voted 4-1 to deny clemency for Postelle, indicating they were not fully convinced by his confession or that they believed the brutality of the crime could not be mitigated by personal factors. On February 16, 2022, 24 hours before his execution, Gilbert Ray Postelle spent his final hours on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. According to records, Postelle had final visits with his lawyer. He was also allowed to make phone calls to a few relatives, although details of those conversations are not available. There is no mention of Postelle writing any final letters. His mood was noted by guards and a chaplain as relatively calm, though with contemplation and acceptance of his fate. No signs of panic or resistance were recorded, showing that he was mentally prepared for his final moments. Gilbert Postelle's last meal was quite simple, with no special or extravagant requests. He asked for a fried chicken sandwich, a hamburger French fries, and a cola. This was a basic meal reflecting a simple choice, perhaps a reflection of a desire for simplicity in his final moments. The meal was served in his private cell in a somber atmosphere and under strict supervision according to standard procedure. At 10:00 a.m. on February 17, 2022, Gilbert Postelle was taken to the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Witnesses present included prison officials, Postelle's lawyer, and representatives of the victims' families. Before the lethal injection process began, Postelle had his last words. Gilbert Postelle's final words were, "I am truly sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for causing this pain to the families, and I'm sorry for taking away your son, your daughter, your brother, your sister, your father, your mother. I am truly sorry for that." He also added, "I hope that one day you can find forgiveness, and I hope that one day you can heal." Jair, these words carry a dual meaning. On one hand, they express clear and direct remorse for his actions, something he had previously masked with claims of not remembering. On the other hand, the call to find forgiveness and heal could be seen as an attempt to lighten his own conscience rather than focusing entirely on the victim's pain. His words created a somber atmosphere in the execution chamber, a possible mix of acceptance and pain for those who witnessed it. For the victims' families, whether these words were enough to soothe their pain remains an unanswered question. The execution by lethal injection was carried out solemnly and according to strict medical procedures. Gilbert Postelle was strapped to a gurney and the lethal drugs were administered intravenously. Reports indicated the process went smoothly with no significant complications noted. At 10:14 a.m., Gilbert Ray Postelle was officially pronounced dead. The immediate reaction after Postelle's death was varied. The victims' families who were present may have felt some relief that justice was finally served, but the pain of loss remained. The media quickly reported the event, highlighting it as one of the next executions after a moratorium in Oklahoma. The public had mixed opinions, with some strongly supporting the death penalty as a form of justice for heinous crimes, while others remained concerned about the method of execution and its humanity. With the death of Gilbert Postelle, this chapter in Oklahoma's criminal history has closed. It is not only the end of a sinful life, but also a painful reminder of the consequences of violence and the indelible scars it leaves on families. After the death of Gilbert Postelle, those involved in this case continued their lives in different ways. Gilbert's brother, David Postelle, is still serving a life sentence without parole in prison. Randall Wade Bias, who took a plea deal to testify against Postelle, likely received a lighter sentence, but still faced legal consequences for his role. The victims' families, like Mary Jo Swindle, must still live with immense loss. Although Postelle's death may have brought some sense of closure, the Gilbert Postelle case also had significant impacts on legal procedures and the death penalty debate in Oklahoma. The class action lawsuit by Postelle and other death row inmates regarding the constitutionality of the lethal injection protocol forced courts to reconsider procedures and evidence about the pain inmates endure. Although Postelle was removed from the lawsuit for religious reasons, not wanting to choose an alternative execution method, the case remains part of the larger debate on capital punishment in the United States, especially after previous botched executions. Concerns about flash pulmonary edema and the sensation of being burned alive that the drugs could cause have spurred discussions about reforming or abolishing the death penalty. Although the Postelle case has concluded with his execution, there are still questions that have not been fully answered. Was the true motive for the murders purely the mistaken belief about Brad Postello's motorcycle accident, or were there other factors, hidden relationships, or deeper resentments that we do not know about? Postelle's testimony about not remembering the crime also leaves a gap in the details and a full understanding of what was going through the perpetrator's mind. If you have any more information, please let us know in the comments below.